Hello there and welcome to another episode of the Middle-earth Play-by-Mail fan channel. What I'm wanting to talk about today is victory points. This is a slightly more advanced strategy thing, so if you've been playing the game for a while, stay around. Victory points, the keen-eyed amongst you will have noticed, are something you get as a little number on your very front turn sheet, and it gives you a number and it's a rough indication of how well your nation is doing. And most players don't really think about victory points, partly because it is assumed they're largely derivative. They don't actually have an input into the game, they are just derived from how you're doing in the game. But, as I will go and explain later, there are ways in which you can use victory points to gather information on what's going on. But first of all, let's talk about what they are and how you get them. Victory points are a single number between 400 and 2000, which gives you a rough guide as to how your nation is doing. They are derived from 4 different categories, notably population centres, armies, wealth and characters. Each nation in the game is ranked according to in each of those 4 categories. And victory points are divvied up so that if you're the top nation in a category, you will get 500 points. And if you're rank 11 or lower, all the way down to say 25, you only get 100 points, with 200 points if you're 10th, and a scale slowly increasing from there all the way up to 500 at first place. Therefore, your victory points, if you are top nation in everything, will be 4 times 500 or 2000. That's the maximum limit. And the lowest you can have will be if you are below 10th place, you're not in the top 10 in any of the 4 categories, in which case you will have 4 times 100 or 400 victory points. Now, there's also, you can, or at least you used to, I'm not sure if it still happens, able to get victory points from fulfilling certain nation goals, like owning the most mithril or holding a particular pop centre at game end. But I'm not looking at that today. That's particularly derivative. But no, what I'm looking at, how is it you can use those victory points to get information on the game? Now, a lot of people don't worry too much about victory points. Maybe they'll play in the last few turns of a game if they know it's coming to an end to try and maximize their victory points, largely, you know, just as a sort of a parting shot, maybe a vanity thing. Maybe they like to do quite well on the leaderboards, and if they can get a high victory point score on a particular nation, maybe make it onto a leaderboard board there. And why not? It's a game, that's part of the fun. But the way I have used them, I don't in every game, is by taking a look at victory points to give me an overall feel for how the game is going. And there are 2 ways of doing this. One is looking at the global victory points across your whole team. And the second one is then trying to break down how the victory points that each individual nation in your team has actually been worked out. And then, particularly if it's a pre-aligned neutrals game, you look at the other half of the side, you know, where you don't have the victory points, you know what the enemy has. I will talk about that in some depth in a minute. But first of all, the global one. I have in a few games just tracked through in a spreadsheet, summing up all the victory points from all the nations on the same side as me. Now, obviously, you need to be in a game where you do have all the turn sheets from everyone on your side. So not only do you have to be in a team where they're sharing, gunboat games where there's no diplomacy, also this won't work. You need full disclosure from everyone on your team. It also works best if neutrals are pre-aligned, because then there are just 2 teams, Free Peoples and Dark Servants. If you've got some neutral nations floating around, it muddies the waters a bit. But assuming you have got all of those things in place, you can add up all the victory points across the whole of your nations, you know, all 10, 12, 13, however many it is, and work out exactly how many of the victory points you've got, and because they're fixed amounts overall within the game, how many your opponents have got. And you can then track that turn by turn and do a nice pretty graph if you like in Excel. Yeah, we like graphs. You can just have a feel for generally how things are going throughout the game. As a rough guide, I found that the free peoples generally will have a slight advantage in victory points. That's because victory points are derived from 4 categories, 3 of which the free peoples have an advantage in, being wealth, which is total amount of gold, population centres, which generate that wealth, and armies, which need that wealth and population centre base to support them. So the free peoples are normally have their noses in front on those 3 areas, whereas the dark servants tend to be slightly ahead on the character side of things. So within the crude measure of the victory points, it does look as if the free peoples are slightly ahead, by which I mean they'll normally have about 53 to 55% of the victory points when a game is well balanced. And I say that only in the 1650 variant of the game. I haven't played enough 2950 to have applied this technique to see what's going on there. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that the free peoples are ahead. It just means they're only ahead on victory points. Within the game, characters, having really good characters is sometimes far more powerful than having, say, a good amount of gold in your treasury, partly because those really good characters are probably agents. They can turn up and steal your gold. Victory points also don't take into account other hidden factors which are very powerful. For example, special nation abilities such as the Cloud Lord getting +20 on assassination and kidnap attempts, which means their characters are a bit more useful than a character who's just got that in, say, mage rank elsewhere and can't do anything quite as useful as assassinations. So, you know, you do take it with a pinch of salt. It's not a 50-50 split. I would say around 53 to 55% is about evens. If you find that you start to vary from that too much, you know that you're doing better or worse. But overall, it will give you a feel as you go through the game as to how you're doing. And certainly there have been some games where I've been looking at the victory points and it's not been heading in the right direction, and it's basically given me cause to go to the team and say, guys, this is slipping a bit. We may not feel like we are, but look at this data. The opposition are pulling ahead of us, and it has helped galvanize the team to really sort of pull together and turn the game round. That's global victory points, giving you a rough feel of how the game is going. But it is possible to use the quirks of how victory points are calculated to try and get a little bit more fine detail as to the relative standings of the two allegiances fighting against each other. Again, this needs to be done without neutrals, and you need full disclosure across all of your team's turn sheets. But basically, you can work out what the ranking of your side's teams are across the 4 categories to try and break down how the particular points, so let's say a particular nation has got 633 victory points, to try and work out where those victory points stack in terms of their ranking in gold, characters, population centres and armies. Now, working out the 1 to 12 ranking for your own nation, for your own nations is quite straightforward on 2 of the 4. Gold, you just look at how much gold they have in their treasury, and whoever on your team has the most gold, they're your number 1, and there's a chance they may be number 1 overall within the game. We'll come on and have a look at how you try and work that out and how you can use that in just a moment. Characters, it's also straightforward. It's purely down to the summation of all character points. So you just have a look at what someone's expenditure on expenses on characters are each turn, and divide it by 20, and that's the number of character points they have. So again, that's an absolute measure. For population centres, it's a little bit harder because it's not just the population centres you have, it's also what loyalty they have. You could try and get some sort of calculation out by going through all the spreadsheets and keying in all the data, but that's who's got time for that? So as a rough ballpark measure, you can just get the total tax base they have out of Jovasir. And then in terms of armies, it's you can again go on Joverseer and have a look at what the total naked heavy infantry for each of your nations is. Again, naked heavy infantry isn't a perfect measure. Sometimes, particularly if you have some starting armies with troops that aren't normally recruiting is heavy infantry and heavy cavalry. But if you've got someone with a whole load of archers in there, they've got low defense but high strength. How that translates into naked heavy infantry is different to how it loads in terms of their overall army ranking. But even so, if someone's got 10,000 naked heavy infantry equivalent and someone's got 200, you know which one is going to be higher on the rankings for the army. But just a word of warning, when you're trying to work out within your own nations who's better than who with regard to population centres and armies, those two measures, you have to be a little bit, take it with a pinch of salt, maybe move things around a bit. So then you kind of rank everyone and see where they're at. But then you start looking at the individual scores for individual nations and see how you can break it down. Now, this is actually easier than it sounds. It's still pretty hard, but if you're the sort of mathematical brain that likes a bit of a mathematical logic problem of seeing the picture from limited data, and quite frankly, if you're playing Middle-earth play-by-mail, you probably are that guy. If that's you, then you can start to figure things out. It's quite a logic problem, can be quite satisfying when it works out. So let's say you take a nation that's got 400 points only. You know automatically that they are outside of the top 10 in every single category. Okay, so you can, start putting together the jigsaw that they are 100 points in each category. Now, you can look at what their character points are, you can look at how much gold they've got, and anyone on your team who has less gold or less character points than them is also outside the top 10. So you can fill in your little grid, or however you're arranging it, that those nations are anchored with 100 points in those categories. You can make a reasonable guess also with armies and with population centres. At the other end, if you had an amazing player whose nation was at 2,000 points, you could assume that they were at 500 points. They were top nation in all four categories, and therefore that would give you an upper ceiling to work with. Now, it's incredibly rare, if it indeed happens at all, that someone ever has that. So how do you work out all those rankings that are between 11 and number 1? Well, fortunately, when you look at the numbers that the victory points come in, and I've got my printed rule book here, and you can see, I'll just hold that up to the camera, some of those points. So if you're first, you get 500 victory points. If you're second, 450, third, 400, and so forth. Now, some of those, given that you can have this set of numbers and you can only add 4 of them together, so you pick from that list there, from 100 to 500, 4 times, add it together, you will end up with some numbers that can only be constructed from certain combinations of what is available. For example, if you have 667 points, you can have a look and say, right, well, the very last number is a 7. And from the list of points available, the only way you can get a 7 as your units digit is if one of your numbers is 367 because you are 4th in one of the categories. So instantly you can say, well, I've got 367. So in one category, that nation is 4th. And in all the other categories, there are 300 points left across 3 other categories. So it's 100 each. So again, it helps set that floor. So you go and have a look. Anything with anyone who's got a 7 at the end, one of their categories is 4th. Now, if that nation which has a category is 4th, but you don't know which one it's in, but then you go and have a look at your overall listing of how all the nations on your side are doing, and you say, oh, this person, they're at number 3 on the gold list. Right, okay, in that case, we know the other guys have got one person with more gold, which actually bumps him in the overall game down to 4th position. So you can work it out that way. There are some other numbers. If you are in 5th position, you get 333 points. So anything ending in a 3, one of your numbers is in 5th position. Anything ending in a 6, then 2 of your categories you are in the 5th position, because there's, 3 plus 3 is 6. So there are a few combinations you have there. If you have something ending in a 2, that means you've got something ending in a 7, 3, 6, 7. So one of the categories is definitely 4th place. And then another one has got 5 on the end of it. So either a 7th or a 9th place. And using this sort of logical mathematical deduction, you can slowly piece together where you think your nations are in the overall 1 to 25 or 1 to 24 in some pre-aligned neutrals games, working out exactly where they all are in relation to the overall game. So let's say, your top nation for gold, they're actually the top nation overall, but your second nation for gold, they're actually 3rd overall in the game. So the enemy has someone, their top nation is 2nd. So what's the point of doing all of this outside of it being a very satisfactory mathematical logic problem? Well, you can, once you know where your nations are across all 4 categories, you know where the opposing side rank. Let's say that with characters, you have the 2nd, the 3rd, and the 5th strongest nations. That means your enemy has the 1st and the 4th, and subsequently, you can work out all the rest out. Starting from which nations so you might say, well, we know on the opposite side, Noldo start with really good characters, and we haven't assassinated many, so we can probably assume that's Board Park Noldo in that area. You can start to get a feel of the relative strengths of nations. Another thing which is really useful if you're really pursuing a strong economic war against the enemy is you can use it to estimate the total amount of gold that their nations have between them. I was in a very tightly contested 2950 match, and we were wanting to try and figure out how our nations were doing economically, which we could see because we were there and we could see all our economies and our gold and stuff, but also how much gold our enemies had. Were we genuinely squeezing them as much as we hoped we were? Well, I did one of these analyses, and I then worked out, who was where in ranks in terms of their gold. And the gold is an absolute figure that we're working off. And you say, oh, right, okay, let's say number 1, we've got the number 1 guy for gold, and he's got 25,000 in his gold reserve. And we've got the number 3 guy for gold, and he's got 20,000 in his gold reserve. So number 1's at 25, number 3 is at 20. Number 2, their richest nation, has between 20 and 25,000 gold. And you can work it all through, and then you can say, oh, our guy at number 10 has 8,000 gold, and we know that 6 of them are below him. So there are 6 guys on the enemy side who have between 0 and 8,000 gold. So collectively, they have 0 to 48,000. And you can add these higher and lower bands, and you can go back to the team and sound very smug and say, guys, I am pretty sure that they have between 55 and, I don't know, 85,000 gold. Let's split the difference, stick it somewhere in between. I reckon they've got about 70,000 in their gold reserves. And you can use this to make a reasonable estimate of where the enemy's gold reserves are at. You can do it for other things. To be honest, with the population centres, characters and armies, it's good to have a good feel. It does give an extra insight. To an extent, it's sort of telling you what, if you're an experienced player and you've been paying attention, you will probably have a feeling for anyway. If you're the Dark Servants and you're there in Mordor and you've been ravaged and attacked for turn after turn, turning around and say, guys, guess what? They've got more population centres and more gold and better armies than us, everyone's going to turn around and say, well, yeah, we know that because Mordor's a burning ruin and all our armies have been killed off and we're all going bankrupt. Tell us something we don't know. But it can be useful in certain areas just to get a feel. So yeah, if you've never tried victory point analysis, why not give it a go? You can do it in the broad terms of just tracking turn by turn to see how things shift over time, or you can do a little bit more fine detail of trying to break down how every nation on your side's victory points are composed, and then using the opposite of that to work out the position and standings of your enemy. And knowledge is power. So yeah, why not give it a go? Victory points. It's not just there to flatter the vain show ponies who don't contribute to the game and just spend all their time training up their characters and building up their cities and their armies and never getting involved or taking risks. They can also be used to try and figure out the standing of the enemy and how the overall game is going. Right, well, I hope you got a good feel for that. It's quite an in-depth one, a bit more of an advanced strategy thing this time round. If you liked it, give the thumbs up. If you've used victory points in this way before, let me know in the comments below. If you've got any other angle on victory points and how they can be used, misused and abused to somehow gain an advantage over the enemy, please let me know. Post it in the comments below, or even better, track me down and message me, because we don't want that sort of information getting into the wrong hands. And if you've enjoyed this, do subscribe, all the cheesy YouTube stuff, so that you'll find out more Middle-earth Play-by-Mail fan guide things when they come out. Anyway, I think I've just about wrung all the juice I can out of victory points for now, so I'll sign off. I hope wherever you are, you're enjoying whatever gaming you're doing and having a good day. Goodbye.